Welcome to Going to Ground. I couldn't resist a return visit to this fascinating site. When I arrived yesterday morning, I thought this is a fairly nondescript patch, if pretty, patch of woodland with little to see, indicating the village. But the closer you look, the more there is, and I'm stood in what just over a century ago might have been somebody's kitchen. I'm on the boundary wall between rooms quite clearly. Not sure if you can see, it's hard to indicate this. There's a wall here and more along here, a raised outline around the building and ridges of brickwork between rooms. It's of singular interest, Snap, because it's one of the last deserted villages of England. I've mentioned to you Imber and Tyneham, which were abandoned during the Second World War. Well, this was just before that. By the end of the First World War, it was everyone had left or been evicted. And when I got back to the car yesterday, I read up in Richard Muir's Lost Villages of Britain. I looked Snap up, and it's mentioned with a particularly interesting story about it. So in a moment I'm going to read that to you. But how quickly things return to the soil. Nature, as great Wiltshire writer Richard Jefferies, nature writer, said, nature has a way of throwing over the things that we've made, the cloak of her own antiquity. Lovely phrase, and it's absolutely true. The ground just embraces anything that we put on it and draws it back into herself, so that it looks just within years part of the natural scene. And in 100 more, this will just be a mound. Everything that we do on the earth, even us, of course, without being too gloomy about it, we all just kind of sink back into the ground. You think of the ground, of the land, as this sort of static, firm thing beneath our feet, but it's constantly moving and changing, and we're just part of it. Anyway, that's a familiar theme for us, but it's so evident. I stood in the middle of what would have been a lively homestead. Let me read this to you. It's really interesting. So this is in a chapter about the impact of sheep on the landscape and the way that the enclosure of common land particularly changed the face of the countryside and moved settlements. And this appears to be one of the very last settlements affected by the introduction of sheep. Almost within living memory. That's why it's so staggering. A curious postscript, he writes, to this chapter comes in the little village of Snap in Wiltshire. This community survived the Middle Ages and parliamentary enclosure and entered the temporal haven of the 20th century. However, the closing years of the 19th century were unfavourable to British agriculture, with foreign competition and a short cycle of climatic decay. Two substantial farms at Snap were untenanted in the 1890s until they were occupied by one John Osmond and then vacated, auctioned and bought by a Ramsbury butcher, Henry Wilson. Ramsbury's just nearby, actually, from where I take my title, so so I'm right at home. Henry Wilson, who owned a little empire of Wessex farms. A strangely medieval scenario was then enacted, with the farms which had provided the employment of Snap being converted into sheep runs. A clearinghouse for Wilson's sheep dealing trade. Deprived of work, the villagers departed, and by the outbreak of the Great War, Snap was deserted, while only 6 families remained in the neighbouring village of Woodsend. The events caused a considerable controversy. In 1914, the sons of Henry Wilson successfully sued the the Member of Parliament for describing their family as oppressive and tyrannical. In 1960, M.W. Smith recreated the story of the collapse of Snap in a Wiltshire archaeological journal, And a fact which is as amazing as the lateness of this sheep desertion emerged. Although scarcely half a century had passed, the people in nearby villages were largely confused concerning the death of their close village neighbour, and it was commonly thought that Snap perished as a result of the failure of its water supply. Folklore enthusiasts sometimes attempt to make history out of legends which are centuries old. Yet here we have a case of a village which died in circumstances which were so controversial that the Member of Parliament was sued, and yet less than 2 generations later, people living nearby had largely forgotten the incident and created a myth. Isn't that interesting? They'd largely forgotten the incident and created a myth. What an instructive tale. And instructive too about the way in which communities change and are shaped by the pursuit of profit, one of the greatest influencing factors on placemaking. And the things that people pursue in common shape the nature of the places that are formed, and many fall by the wayside as a result. It's been lovely to share this week of Lost Villages with you. God bless you as you go to ground.